Borsted at University of Bonn, Hannah Spiro, who is working with me at Boise State, Melody Shee at, actually has a bit out of date, she's at NYU right now, so she did work with Kyle in Columbia, she did some work with me at BSU, and now she's at NYU. Kyle, David George, Randy, Marcia, and I wasn't sure when, normally when I give a talk, I put, the title of the workshop, the date, and then the location. So I wasn't sure where to put the location, but I just went ahead and, whoops, why am I not, there we go. Gave you a map. Here I am in Boise. Okay. So ForestClaw, what is ForestClaw? Well, it's a parallel adaptive library for logically Cartesian mapped multi-block domains. So it's inspired by things like AMRClaw, GeoClaw, and other adaptive mesh refinement codes. So it's based on the main difference between, say, ForestClaw and, say, something like GeoClaw or AMRClaw is that it's based on an existing mesh management library called PForest. And I'll say more about that. It's a quad tree library, so it's a tree-based code. So each leaf of a quad tree contains a fixed uniform grid. So it has the same flavor as, say, something like GeoClaw or AMRClaw. It has an multi-rate time stepping, mapped multi-block capabilities, which kind of set it apart from, say, AMRClaw. So we can solve on cube spheres, for example. So this allows for certain flexibility of physical domains. And it has, I've designed it so that you can easily extend ForestClaw with various solvers. And it uses essentially the same numerical time stepping algorithms as was originally developed in the Berger, Oliger, Colella version of adaptive mesh refinement. Of course, GeoClaw, most of you are familiar with it, but I thought I'd just give a quick overview just to sort of put in context, how I view GeoClaw. And GeoClaw is obviously, it's a library for depth average geophysical flows, and it overcomes several technical challenges that makes this a challenging problem. It has Riemann solvers which robustly handle wet and dry states so that there's no need to track the evolving flood boundary. It seamlessly handles reading and interpolation of multiple possibly overlapping topography files. It has a well-balanced scheme to maintain steady states. Numerical gauges allow for easy comparison with observational data, and has a shared memory parallelism and adaptive mesh refinement. Okay, so some of these features, like the adaptive mesh refinement in particular, really set GeoClaw apart from other codes that do modeling in the same kind of domain, AdCirc and things like that. Okay, so here's just an example of again, those of you who've used GeoClaw are probably very familiar with this example, but it's a cool example, so you can never see it too often. This is called the bowl slosh example, and the idea is that we have a bowl with water in it that sloshes around. And what you see here is that colored region is the water. So you see the evolving boundary, so that's really, so without doing any front tracking, we're able to do a really good job or GeoClaw is able to do a really good job of capturing that evolving front. The nice thing about this particular example is that there's an exact solution to the shallow water wave equations. What does this look like using GeoClaw? Well, if we look at a top-down version of this, we see the familiar sort of adaptive meshing. And you notice I refer to this as patch-based AMR. And it uses, and one of the advantages of GeoClaw is that it has you can use a variety of refinement factors. I think in this problem, it was using a refinement factor of 4, which allows you to really aggressively refine. Rectangular patches can be of any size. So here we have large coarse patches and smaller fine patches. And when I say of any size, what I mean is the actual grid resolution. Obviously, the fine patches are going to be smaller, but they're actually more points per patch on the finer grids than on the coarser grids. Finer grids are layered on top of coarser grids, and here you can kind of get the impression that these coarse grids are sort of floating, or the fine grids are kind of floating on top of the coarse grids, and that's exactly what's happening. Of course, it uses the original Berger-Regustos algorithm for adaptively dynamically adapting the meshes. So again, we take for granted that if we're going to do adaptive mesh refinement, we're actually going to adapt in time. But outside of this sort of small AMR community, this is not a widely used technology. More often, people will simply statically refine a region and then solve their problem on a statically refined mesh that doesn't change in time. So this is, of course, what really sets something like GeoClaw apart from other codes, is that it can do this adaptive meshing. Uses, as Kyle was mentioning, uses shared memory parallelism over using OpenMP. The mesh refinement itself, though, is not parallelized. That's only serial. So that ultimately could lead to a bottleneck in scaling. If at some point, there's only so much parallelism you can get out of sweeping over patches. At some point, the actual remeshing at every time step or every few time steps, if that's done in serial, that can become a bottleneck to sort of good scaling performance. And then finally, there's a CUDA version available. Randy had a student who just graduated who did a really nice job of demonstrating that you can get good speed up using CUDA and GeoClaw. Okay, so ForestClaw on the same problem has a slightly different mesh structure. So it's a quad tree based mesh structure. I refer to this as block based. So what you see is there's a lot more grids. So that might be concerning. Turns out that's not a problem. The grids are all the same size. There's an exact refinement factor of 2. Okay, so to go from a coarse grid to a fine grid, you can only refine by a factor of 2. The patches occupy quadrants or octants of a tree structure. They're not overlapping, so this is really a composite grid. So underneath a fine grid, there's nothing. There's no coarse grids at all. Okay, the mesh management is based on PForest, which I'll say a bit more about. You can go to pforest.org and check that out. It uses distributed parallelism using MPI. So because we have this nice quad tree structure, it's going to be fairly straightforward to figure out how to distribute patches to processors. Okay, so we can take full advantage of a machine. I've written a CUDA version, so I have some CUDA examples in the main code that actually scale pretty well. I get something like 5 to 5, and if I stretch it, maybe 10 times speed up. And then we've shown scaling on MPI up to about 65,000 cores on Jukin for a fairly simple problem, a 2D simple problem. So and then of course, if you go to more complicated problems, it gets harder to actually come up with good scaling examples. Okay. Okay, so just again, this is just a brief overview of ForestClaw. So basically, this thing on the left here is what we have as far as patches go. So we definitely, each patch is refined by a factor of 2. The patches are all the same size. So in this example here, each patch is 8 by 8. Each patch has a layer of ghost cells. So all of that should be fairly familiar. And communication occurs between ghosts by filling ghost cells. Okay, the code itself is written mostly in C. I like to refer to it as object-oriented C, but it really is just C. So a user who's not familiar, who comes from a Fortran background, shouldn't have too much trouble looking at the C code. You have to know something about pointers, but if you can get over that hurdle, I think the code itself is, I keep it fairly clean. The core routines are agnostic as to what you put in these patches, what solvers are used, etc. I kind of refer to ForestClaw as a PDE layer that sits on top of PForest. And inside this layer, all kinds of things can be customized. So for example, the solver, the interpolation scheme, the averaging, ghost filling can all be customized by the user. I have pretty good support for legacy codes. So we've taken several legacy codes and ported them to ForestClaw, and that's been pretty successful. So again, here's just the main outline. So we have core routines. PForest is the best management library. ForestClaw contains core routines that manage things like time stepping, dynamic grid management, input, output, things like that, but basically knows nothing about what is inside of each box. So a user could come along and say, I don't want to use a cell-centered grid, I want to use a node-based grid. And then as long as they're willing to say, write a patch, a set of, write the various things that they would need to for that type of patch, they're able to do that. And ForestClaw wouldn't care at all. Okay, so these patches are kept separate from the actual core routines. And then on top of that is a variety of solvers. I've implemented both versions of ClawPack, GeoClaw, Ash3D is a code I did with the USGS, and we're currently implementing a multi-grid solver that we should have, we're sort of beta testing it now, and we're working on the parallelization of it now. Okay. So this is where a user would, so a user who comes along and has, say, their own solver, they would, on this left-hand side is where they would implement their code, and they would then describe how do I update on a patch, etc. So why do you want to use a tree-based AMR code? Well, there's some advantages over, say, the original Berger-Oliger patch-based AMR. Regular neighbor connectivity simplifies grid communication. So you know that your neighbors are either you've got two neighbors, a neighbor of the same size, or one coarse neighbor. And this is going to simplify the development of numerical algorithms. The patches aren't overlapping. So this, in some sense, allows, simplifies post-processing at the very least, because we're not worried about where the solution lives. There is only one place for the solution. The quad tree octree is well suited for emerging hardware. Since all the patches are the same size, you can batch process thousands of patches at once on, say, a GPU. Space filling curves, since they're all equal sized, it's easy to load balance by using a space filling curve. And that's the sort of thing that PForest manages. So I don't actually have to do that. I am able to use all the mechanisms that PForest has for doing tiling. I haven't been keeping an eye on the time here, so I'll just keep going here. I'm about halfway done. Mesh management algorithms are decentralized. So this means that, again, all the meshing strategy is decentralized. So you can expect so you don't have this serial bottleneck of the mesh refinement algorithm itself being serial. So it's actually parallelized. There's very limited metadata requirements. And by that, I mean that since every patch is the same size, we don't need to store data about where a fine grid sits on top of a coarse grid, for example, or how big each grid is. And although it may not seem like that data is very, memory intensive, it turns out that for really large problems, if you need to start storing that kind of metadata on every processor, that really limits the scalability. And I think some of these larger codes that are using kind of the original Berger-Oliger type refinement are hitting some limits when it comes to scaling, say, beyond 20,000 cores. Potential disadvantage, of course, is this 2-to-1 refinement ratio. And this can lead to over-refinement in some flows over large spatial domains. So, for example, flows where you want to solve over, say, the entire Pacific Ocean, you might find that you have to over-refine, which can, in principle, could slow down the code, right? So in that sense, it may be on a desktop, it might not be competitive with something like GeoClaw. Of course, if you need to really go to, say, using a larger, you want to run on a supercomputing, say, center, then you would have access to more nodes, which could sort of mitigate that problem. So anyway, and so why do we want to use an existing mesh library like PForest? Well, basically, the idea is to outsource the burden of maintaining one of the most complex parts of an AMR code. That's the mesh refinement. I did a quick check on the number of lines of code in classic ClawPack, looking at just the code, the library routines in source 2D. And there's 26 files and about 1,600 lines of code. You go to AMR Claw, also looking at just the files in source 2D. There's about 5 times as many files and about 6 times as many lines of code. And of course, what are all those extra files doing? Well, they're doing all the mesh management, the ghost filling, the tagging, the refinement, the remeshing, just all the things that go into an AMR code. And to be honest, I'm surprised it's only 5 times as many, because I sort of in the back of my mind have always had the idea that it's got to be at least 10 times as many lines of code and number of files. GeoClaw has fewer number of files, but it's about 1,300 lines of code, so about 7 or 8 times. But of course, GeoClaw also has lots of things that are managing all the geophysical side part of the code. So this was kind of my main reason, is that I didn't want to have to manage all the infrastructure of maintaining an AMR call, of maintaining an adaptive mesh code. And since there's a group of developers who are actively developing PForest, and that's all they do, I'm happy to let them do that. So, but again, you know, why use PForest, or what is it? Well, again, it's this highly scalable meshing library. It manages this forest of octrees, and it encapsulates the AMR meshing details. Okay, it's this tree-based infrastructure, allows, and one of the advantages for something like GeoClaw is that it can do efficient searches needed to do things like locate gauges and regions. Randy talked about polygons. All of those things can be done in order and work in PForest. And it's developed by an active group of developers that sort of spread out over the globe. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, in Germany, and then at Georgia Tech. And I think there are others involved too. And it's being widely used in a number of pretty large scale projects: DEAL2, PETC, NUMA and NUMO at NPS, or Atmosphere and Ocean Codes. And it's been involved in some Gordon Bell Prizes, etc. Okay, so GeoClaw Extension of ForestClaw is it's just a handful of routines that I really pulled over from GeoClaw: Riemann solvers, files for reading topo files, adaptive criteria for tagging cells and to regenerate the mesh. I've pulled numerical gauges into the core routines of ForestClaw, so of course GeoClaw can use those. And then all the visualization can be done using BizClaw, MATLAB, Visit, ParaView, Google Earth, etc. And of course, again, the dynamic grid adaptation is fully distributed to MBI processes, and it uses this space filling curve for load balancing. So I'll just run through a couple of examples here. So here's the Chile example. This is just a slide, and with any luck, I can show you this in Google Earth. So this is some of the Google Earth visualization that I've done. Let's see if this is going to work now, because sometimes it's a little. Oh, here we go. Okay, so you can see where the quad tree refinement is going to be different than what you see in say GeoClaw. If you haven't used this Google Earth visualization, it's we also have regions. So we've got regions defined, or ForestClaw will use regions, so that's that. And this is one of the examples available that you can download. Let's see here. Where did I go? There we go. Gauges. So gauges are in there, and if you click on the little place mark thing in the Google Earth icon, a plot like this shows up. We've also done a project. This is a current project I'm working on with Hannah Spiro at BSU. So in 1976, the Teton Dam in eastern Idaho failed. It was an earthen dam project and basically flooded a good part of eastern Idaho all the way down to Rexburg and into the Snake River. So this is some output from GeoClaw visualized on Google Earth. And what we're seeing is that the GeoClaw results actually follow pretty closely the historical record. And here's again using the ForestClaw refinement strategy. So it does pretty aggressively refines just in the regions where we have water. And that red line is actually the historical flood boundary. So we were happy to see that that the water stays, that GeoClaw does a pretty good job of keeping the water right inside that red historical flood boundary. And then as far as parallel efficiency, we're happy to see pretty good parallel efficiency. These are some older results done on our cluster at BSU, but it went from originally about 6 hours to down to about half an hour. And that's with close to over 80% parallel efficiency, which is actually pretty good. Where all the time is spent so there is a fair amount of time spent in ghost filling and ghost communication. But again, all of that is parallelized, so that so as you increase the number of processors, you can cut down on, say, the time spent ghost filling. Regridding is essentially, there's essentially no time spent on regridding. So that's one of the nice things again about PForest is that that's virtually negligible. So why would you use this version of GeoClaw over AMR-Claw? Well, you might like to run in a distributed environment. You might be interested in software development and would like to contribute. You would like to use more complex geometry, say, for example, a cube sphere, or you might like to see how, say, ClawPack performs on GPUs. Of course, there's the CUDA version of GeoClaw, so you could try that out too. And if you're interested, I've got, you can go to the GitHub wiki page, and but I'm also going to be here to ask any questions if someone has questions. So I think that was that. And I guess one more comment is that if you're using GeoClaw currently, you're probably familiar with set run and set plot. And I have essentially versions of those which are virtually identical. I don't use the ClawPack or the GeoClaw makefile system. So I've created a Python code called make data and make plots, but effectively those look identical to the corresponding set run and set plots files. And that's pretty much, I mean, I want to say that's effectively all you really need to do to set up an application. I thought well, I don't know if I should show code, but let's see here. Here we go. Yeah. So this is just looking again at that Chile example, and what you see, there's one C code here, a .cpp file that you pretty much don't need to touch. So you can leave that alone. Everything else is either the Python files or there's a make file that just in case you want to include, say, a different kind of initialization. And this is all kept up pretty much to date. I don't know that I've kept this up with the latest 5.7 code, but what I've found in the past is that the core routines that I rely on for GeoClaw or for the GeoClaw extension don't change very much. And so that I'm able to, so that I really, at least the core routines in the GeoClaw extension of ForestClaw, I'm able to keep up to date with the latest versions of GeoClaw. Things that are changing, of course, is that we don't have, for example, FGMax grids and some of the fancier stuff that Randy's talked about. Although those things are certainly all quite possible using the PForest framework. Okay, I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions. Where did my chat go? Right, like, so let's see here.
Great, thank you, Donna. Yeah, if there are questions, please paste them in the chat.
I'm trying to find my chat window. This is the problem. I don't know. Has anybody else figured this out? Like, I don't know where it goes.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
I found it, but it was like under more and the little script that shows up when you're.
Oh, there we go. Chat. Oh, okay.
Your screen.
Yeah, there he is. Okay, I got it. I mean, I can also answer questions later on if anybody wants to. We can move on to the next talk or.
Well, let's give people a minute. It takes people a minute to formulate their questions sometime. But I'll take prerogative and actually ask an oral question as long as we have a little gap here. So I was just wondering what the sort of biggest problems that have been solved with the Geo version of ForestClaw so far. What,
I think
or with any version of ForestClaw for that matter.
Yeah, that Teton Dam problem is probably the biggest. I mean, other problems that we've solved with, say, the Ash 3D code, we've solved some pretty big problems. Yeah.
Maybe you could say a bit about Ash 3D and the 3D aspect of it.
Right. So what we're currently doing, so Ash 3D was an existing serial single grid code that the USGS was developing for tracking volcanic ash dispersion. And so what we did is we took that code, and so since it was 3D, and ForestClaw is currently only 2D, although we've got plans and works to develop the 3D version, we were able to just take 3D bricks and put them into the 2D refinement, and we're actually able to port their code, I would say, with virtually no changes to their existing Fortran, serial Fortran code. and we were able to convert it into a parallel adaptive code. Yeah, so I'm happy to have people, you know, I guess we could push some of the GeoClaw. I'm sure when we start, so Hannah's been working with me, and she's been using GeoClaw up to this point, and she wants to start using ForestClaw. And I have a feeling we'll be able to push the code, the Teton Dam code, a lot farther using ForestClaw. And so if anybody's interested in maybe just trying it out, I would be more than. I also would love to have contributors, because, you know, there's things I need to clean up on it, but it's also nice to have people who are, you know, actively interested in using it. So yeah.
We should definitely look at trying to do some of our applications in ForestClaw. I've been saying that for a while, but maybe during our hackathon the next couple of days, we can actually spend a little time trying on a big problem.
Well, I was looking at the Tohoku example, and I ran into some questions about how that I had run that code a long time ago from, I think, Randy, you had some examples that you did for a paper, and I had that working in GeoClaw, and this week I started looking at thinking, well, I've been meaning to get this into GeoClaw, ForestClaw, let's do that now. So I got it running pretty easily, actually, and now I'm just trying to fiddle with the regions and things to try to get the refinements to match up, because I think you were using refinement factors of like 5 and 6 and 4, and when you have to refine by factors of 2, I have to kind of try to figure out how to get the levels to sync up.
Right.